Cool. I'll follow you all up there. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Battery. My name's Colleen. I lead the programming here, and I'm so thankful that you all came tonight for one of our Women's March programs for this month. We've got a lot more programming in store, so look on the website if you're interested in more of that. But tonight, we welcome Deepa Purushothaman and Sally Thornton for a discussion about Deepa's recently released book, The First, the Few, the Only. Congratulations. It's a deeply personal call to action for women of color and their allies to find power in community and advocate for a new corporate environment of belonging and acceptance. A couple of housekeeping items. We are live streaming tonight on our Battery TV YouTube channel. Also, Folio Books is in the back selling copies of Deepa's book. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, I believe Deepa will be signing them informally after. So start thinking of your questions as we go through tonight. And it's my pleasure to share a little bit more about our speakers for the evening. In addition to being an author, Deepa is also the co-founder of nFormation, a company which provides a brave, safe, and new space for professionals who are women of color. Prior to this, Deepa spent more than 20 years at Deloitte and was a first, an Indian American woman and one of the youngest people to make partner in the company's history. Deepa's mission is to help women of color navigate the complex and often opaque corporate structures of today, helping them not only take a seat at the table, but change the way the table is formed. Love that. And joining Deepa is Sally Thornton. In addition to being a Battery member, Sally is the CEO and founder of Forche, a film that offers a modern approach to executive recruiting with the unusual blend of supporting overworked teams with interim experts in the people, HR, and marketing domain, all grounded with inclusion and diversity and belonging. Sally is a frequent keynote speaker on women in leadership, harnessing the value of multi-generational and diverse workforce and talent recruiting and engagement strategies. We're so glad to have them here. Sally and Deepa, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. The light went out and I was like, is it going to work?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Awesome.
You'll let us know if you can't, right?
Yes. Thank you for those of you who could join us in person. It's really exciting to see humans in real life. And for those of you streaming in your jammies, I'm a little jealous. We're going to jump right in because we had a little pre-talk about what is the one thing that we would love for everyone to walk away with. And we still hope you stay after the one thing, but we're going to start with like the meatiest part, which is the myth of meritocracy. So can you talk to us about like when you became aware that work is told to us should be a meritocracy, but you realized maybe it's not?
Yes. So that is the big idea I was sharing with Sally, that if you only took away one idea, it was the idea, the myth of meritocracy. So I start the book with 10 delusions that I think are really present in corporate America. And for me, the biggest one is this idea of meritocracy. I think many of us are taught early on that if you work hard, you will progress, you will get ahead. I think that's especially true. And I should back up and maybe give a little bit of information. I interviewed over 500 women of color in writing this book and a number of business leaders and a number of experts. And I would hear that over and over again. I would hear that most of us were taught from very little, from being little girls, that if you worked hard, you would get ahead. That was not always true of everybody, though. So some Black women were taught, the system is broken, and even if you work hard, you are not going to get ahead. You're going to have to work harder than everybody else. But I would say 95% of the women I interviewed, that was the case. And that just sets us up for such a really difficult situation because women are working hard. They're leaning in, right? We talk so much about leaning in, and we never talk about the fact that the system acts differently for some of us and that it is different. And part of what I found as I started to shop that idea around is that people had real challenge in even admitting that out loud because we've always been taught it's a meritocracy. If you work hard, you'll get ahead. But where does that come from? Why have we been taught that? And why is there such difficulty in even opening that conversation? It almost seemed like a prized topic that I couldn't, or like a guarded discussion that I couldn't unpack because there was such fear in unpacking it. And so one of the stories I tell in the book, and I open the entire book with this story, is I sat down with Renee Myers. She is the VP of Inclusion at Netflix, and she's a good friend of mine. And she was talking about airplane design. I went to meet her about inclusion, and she started talking about airplane design. And she was saying when her children were younger, she used to really struggle because when she would have to put the luggage overhead, she always worried that it would fall on them, whenever there was turbulence. And she was saying as a mom, she would have never designed the airplane in such a way that the luggage was going overhead. Yeah. And if your mom's in the audience, it's probably something you thought about.
Yes.
And I jumped in right away because I'm 5'1", I'm 5'2", maybe with heels. And I'm 5'1". So putting the luggage overhead, and I've done 2 cities in 48 hours. Both times I struggled with putting my luggage overhead is a real issue. And I feel like I don't belong almost a half an hour before I go on the airplane. And I feel that sense of belonging at least 10 minutes until I sit down. So that sense of not belonging is acute. It's real. It's there. And I often go right to, why did I pack so much? And why am I not tall enough? And why did I not wear the right shoes? And all of those questions about me without really recognizing the fact that it wasn't necessarily designed with, me in mind. And so as Renee and I were talking, I ended up doing some more research on airplane design. So what I found was only 2 or 3% of actual airplane designers back in the 70s, when this was actually thought of, were actually women. So we were not in the room. So I don't know that our height or the fact that we were moms worrying about our children was considered in the design. And that's such a part of the discussion that I think we need to have about corporate America. It's still based on a lot of principles from decades, decades and decades and decades ago, where there was a 2 model household, right? Where one usually stayed at home. It was usually the woman, and the man went out to work. That's kind of the model that corporate America is based on. And it's never been updated to really account for the fact that we have different needs, that we have different desires, that we work in different ways. And so when we talk about the meritocracy, we are talking about the fact that it's asking us to be a certain way to rise. We're asking everybody to show up and behave in a certain way, but we're not actually taking account of the fact that we have different needs, we have different expectations, we want different things, and there's no space to have that conversation. So for me, that's like one of the biggest challenges that we have. And also, we're not allowed to talk about it, because when you talk about it, it's almost like we've said something bad or something inappropriate about this really guarded, perfect thing that we're not supposed to talk about. And I think if we don't unpack it, we can't fix it. And so for me, the idea that it is a meritocracy just sets us up for working harder, right? And when you don't get ahead, it actually suggests that we're not working hard enough, or there's something wrong with us. And that was so consistent with so many of the women of color I met. And part of why I wrote the book was I wanted us to know that we were not alone, because I think many of us end up in situations where we are working harder, we are asking for more. And for a lot of reasons, the system doesn't work in our favor, whether that's promotion, whether that's hiring, whether that's advancement. And we end up wondering, is it us? And I think sometimes it's okay to say, well, it may not always be us. There may be something else that is happening around us that also needs to be talked about.
Yeah. One of my favorite philosophers in life is Tina Fey. And she said the rules of life of improv is yes and. Like, yes, there are things we can take in our control, and there's some water we're swimming in that we need to question, which I love as a theme throughout your book, is to stay curious, right? So the way we are raised, the way we are told, business will work, or academia, or whatever field. Raise your hand if you're in business. Okay, most people. Raise your hand if you're in academia. Raise your hand if it's something else, nonprofit. Anyone want to speak up and say what it is? Nonprofit. All right. I think I got 3 majors. Anything else? Anyone? Entrepreneurship. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, this myth of meritocracy, because it's like a belief system. It's like, we think things should be fair. Like, that's our favorite 4-letter F word. It's like, it will be fair. And when it's not, it questions everything, right, about also maybe our internal value. I'd love for you to talk about how you brought this up of, like, if you can't work 80-hour weeks, if you have a limitation, whether that's health, anyone want good health, taking care of young kids, aging parents, things outside of work, which in social science, they call it the ideal worker, is tall, white, straight man who has a stay-at-home wife. Therefore, he has no attachments and he can work all the time. This is actually just a social science term, not to get you all angry. I hope you do feel a little anger inside, but I'd love for you to talk about, like, when you started to realize that, like, wait, what about these limitations, and what does that say about how we navigate that? And maybe even a little bit how the limitations can fuel our creativity, that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I mean, I think the myth of meritocracy goes hand in hand with the idea that there is this ideal worker and that we all have to become that ideal worker and there's no other path or no other way of being, right? The corporate world, and again, the book is based on corporate America, but I've now met with many other people. I shouldn't just say women people. And I find that the items and the theories in the book actually apply to nonprofits. I've been working with women in the military. It applies across the board because there's a lot of things that we've been taught about the workplace in general that doesn't work for most people. I also think it applies to a lot of the men that I'm meeting with as well, who I think for them, they've been taught to want these things. And in a lot of ways, they've never even had the space to question, does this even work for me? And a lot of my peers and folks who are younger want to be home to raise their children, want space to do different things. And the ideal worker myth doesn't work for them either. But again, we haven't had permission to question that. So for me, it became, I think, a growing question as I was rising in the organization. I moved up the ladder very quickly, and I had always loved it. But there was always this sense of, and I talk about in the book, this idea of conform, perform, and produce are three values that really drive corporate culture and really drive a lot of our workplaces. And the idea that you conform, so especially as women of color, I think we give up a lot of our identity. I think we give up parts of ourselves to fit into this ideal worker mythology, which has historically and traditionally been a white male leader who's come before us. And those are the characteristics that we reward. So that's conform. The perform is this idea of productivity, right? And that everything is perfection. So a lot of the women that I interviewed really were focused on doing well. They felt like they had all eyes on them. And so that there was no room for them to err and that they had to be perfect in what they did. And also productivity. So many of us who are raised in this country or come to this country as immigrants in particular had this sense or this idea that we are raised with of productivity, that performance and doing more and efforting is really how to get ahead and how to do well. And part of what I think is not working and why the last couple of years in this COVID bubble that we've been in have asked us different questions is because we're asking what place we want work to take in our lives. For a lot of us, we have realized that we are living to work. And I think many of us are now kind of stepping back as a result of the last couple of years and asking different questions. Like, does that even make sense? Like, how did that happen? Where did that come from? Like, when did that become the norm? So for me, it actually became really real in the last couple of years of my time with Deloitte. So I'm only a year and a half out. So I'm very recently departed from corporate. And in my last 3 years, I started to get really sick. And it started as, one sort of what I call a mysterious symptom. And then it grew and grew and grew. And at one point I had 16 or 20 different things going on all at the same time. I'd seen I think at this point, my 14th doctor, and I was on my path to my 15th doctor. Everyone agreed there was something wrong with me, but they couldn't figure out what it was. And I tell a story in the book where I had seen this doctor. She was a doctor I saw when I traveled to San Diego. And it's important because I went in with my rolly board that's downstairs right now. And I put it in the corner. And so this is the third time I've seen this doctor. And she's looking at me and you can see her like eyeing my suitcase in the corner. Like, why is this woman coming to a doctor's appointment with a suitcase? Like already judging that there's something broken with me. And she proceeds to say, like, we've run hundreds of tests and we agree that there's something wrong with you, but I want to ask you a different question. I think your job is killing you. And what would you do if you didn't do this job? Do you have to have a big job like this to be powerful or feel good about yourself? And don't you see yourself as just worthy being you? And I remember just willing myself to not cry, like coming out of that conversation, because I felt so like literally not seen, but seen through, right? And part of what I think in that moment was really real for me is I saw a lot of value in my identity and my job and what I had done and like all these accolades I had received. And yet my health was suffering. And I think this is a very new realization for me just in the last couple of years where I realize now success and health are not two different ideas, that in order for me to be successful, I have to be healthy. But I think if you had asked me that question prior to COVID or prior to doing this work, I don't know that those two things would have been tied. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. I think many of us are asking different questions as a result. And so for me, it's a values question. Like, why are we rewarding sacrificing time with our family and who we are and what we believe and how we show up and how we dress and how we wear our hair, all of these things in order to fit into a culture that maybe doesn't really want to see us or doesn't even care if we're healthy? And how do we ask different questions? And I'm not saying everyone should leave corporate or leave workplaces. That's not my goal. But my goal is that we need to have different conversations so we can evolve these spaces so they actually do work for more of us in a very different way.
I love that. It's like mic drop, but I'm going to hold it. So Stanford did this work called Redesigning and Redefining Work. It was maybe like 10 years ago. for this exact purpose, which was how do we also figure out where inclusion includes the majority? So when we talk about inclusion, we often talk about the underrepresented groups. And yet what you brought up brilliantly is that it doesn't work actually for the majority as well. So when you look at data of how white straight men are feeling about work and inclusion, there's this great research by Christy Smith and Kenji Yoshino called Uncovering. And essentially it is that men cover too. They might cover that they're dyslexic. They might cover that they grew up poor. They might cover up an accent from a zip code that wasn't as cool or something like that. But the point is that we have a very narrow view culturally of what success looks like. And so even the majority, when they present like the majority, are still covering. And so back to the science of like productivity, because we want to move to a true meritocracy. True meritocracies or when every voice is included, we're not covering up our identities, right? And we're having conversations that are honest and vulnerable about well-being. The other point of data, and then I want to go back to your question, is design constraints actually fuel creativity. So your point on productivity is like more is not better. One of the big myths around work is that more work is better, but it's a myth. You actually see more mistakes, essentially you have more anger between, like colleagues. Like if you think about the people who are the most overworked in an organization, they typically aren't well loved and respected, right? So Stanford D School has done research that basically says when you have time constraints on collaboration, productivity actually goes up, creativity goes up. And most companies, creativity matters more because we're less in a manufacturing environment. So, but breaking these norms, so how might we consider breaking them? So now that we see the water we're swimming in, it's not incredibly healthy for anyone, right? It's not working yet for the inclusion. What are some steps that you're seeing of like, okay, I have some real optimism about some of these things that will help us usher in more of a meritocracy more quickly?
Yeah, I think the work that we have to do, I call it the power of me and the power of we. So I think part of what we have to do is we have to start pulling apart in ourselves the narratives that we've been taught. And many of these narratives and many of these things come from childhood. So they can usually, and they're usually about 10 or 12 things we were taught very early on, usually from the age of 4 to 7. And they are messages that will replay when we get into difficult situations. So you're not enough. You need to work harder. You need to do more. You're not smart enough. And those messages, if you actually pay attention, like next time you're in a difficult situation, you'll hear your parents' voices like telling you those messages. And so part of what we have to do is we have to shed those messages. And so, again, I start the book with this list of delusions or this list of things we have to shed about corporate America. But there's also work we have to do, that power of me work, where we have to shed messages that we've been taught. I think especially as women and women of color, we are taught a lot of things that leadership doesn't look like us, that, we aren't powerful, that we have to behave a certain way if we want to, be rewarded in certain ways. And some of those messages actually don't serve us, but we haven't really unpacked what those are. So sometimes when I speak with groups, I actually ask them to think about a pilot, to think about a CEO, think about a professor, think about a politician. And I'll, give them a long list of things. And I'll ask, like in the group, and usually in a much more of a mixed group, and I'll ask them to raise their hand. But inevitably, everyone ends up thinking of white men in those examples. Usually they're in a suit. Sometimes a professor is in a sweater vest, but they're always kind of in a suit.
Sweater vest.
And but what's interesting is the women do that. Even I do that when I think of those things. And so it's an example of the messages we have to rewrite for ourselves, right? So I call it shedding narratives that don't work for us. And as I interviewed women, what I found is that the ones that had found their power, the ones that had actually found their voice, had actually gone through some sort of difficult situation where, whether it was divorce, whether it was a family issue, whether it was cancer, whether it was like a work situation where they were treated unfairly, they ended up having to kind of reevaluate for themselves, like, why did this happen to me? And what do I believe? Because everything I've been taught about working harder and doing more and overperforming and hiding parts of myself didn't actually help me in these situations, these life events.
I feel so seen.
But that's what it is. So it's kind of shedding those messages. And then the other part, what I think we need to find is the power of we. So what I found with a lot of these women is they're high performing women. They're also very lonely. I mean, I was, working easily, hours and hours and hours. I could say 100. There were many weeks I worked 100 hours. And so there wasn't time to have friends, right? There wasn't time to meet with other people. And so a lot of these women were actually very lonely and very, burdened with what was happening to them at work, the microaggressions, the racism, the sense of all eyes on them, and they had nowhere to go to talk about it. And so what I have found, and part of why we created nFormation, was that there is real power in community. So what I have found with a lot of these women is if they just get on a group chat with 2 or 3 other women and share, like, this just happened to me, someone just said something inappropriate, they're able to release that sort of pain or that sort of shame in a very quick way. Whereas if they don't have that group, they end up carrying it. So the research that I found suggests that we hold on to negative comments 4 times as long as we hold on to a positive compliment. And so we end up carrying these microaggressions or this racism quite a long time if we don't find ways to process it and let it go from our body. So that power of we is really important. I think a lot of these women also felt like it was them, like they weren't enough, they didn't do enough, they weren't conforming in the right ways. And what they found in being community is that it really wasn't them. And so to maybe back up to the beginning, because it can also maybe lay the stage for some of this work, is I really struggled with whether or not I wanted to leave my role. I'd given up so much to get there. It felt like I had just arrived and I had 20 more years in front of me, and it almost was like being a tenured professor. Like, why would you give it up when you've just gotten to the tenure seat? I'd known for 3 years, though, I was unhappy and I wanted to leave. And I was really struggling because I was the first, right? And as the first, I felt like if I left, there would be some sense of like I failed, but I also was failing for the women of color around me. And so I felt very responsible. In an attempt to figure out what I wanted to do, I started meeting with women of color. And so it started as one-on-one, then it turned into 2-person and 3-person dinners. And then at one point I did about a dozen dinners across the country, which were 20 or 30 women of color each, all VP level and above. I thought we were getting together for an hour or 2. We were going to talk about, how to network, what are some, women of color friendly companies, where does one go at a senior level? But instead we would get in these rooms and we would be there in some cases for 6, 7, 8 hours. At 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, we were still sitting there because these women were so isolated. They were so alone. They hadn't realized that what was happening to them was happening to everybody. And so we shared stories about what was happening around the microaggressions, around the racism, around the navigating, around the feelings of feeling you had all eyes on you, or even the code switching and all the other things, a list of things that are different for women of color. To go back to the idea of meritocracy, there's a lot that is different for women of color. And I think part of the challenge is we don't really understand what that looks like. So the women of color that I interviewed had so many extra things that they did at work. And in the book, I call it the job and the job. So there's all these extra things that we get asked to do that we don't talk about. So whether that is as simple, and I say it's a spectrum, so simple as I know whenever I was at the company and they were going to take pictures at a large event, I knew I was going to be photographed, right? Because I was one of the only women of color. You're
Hurry,
shaking your
get
head,
over there, get in the middle.
Yeah. So I know I'm going to get photographed. That's like a simple thing, and it happened to a lot of the women of color. And there would be more complicated things, right? So some of the women of color I interviewed, like literally mentored 200 to 300 other women of color because there were so few of them at a senior level. Some of them actually carried other burdens. So one of the women that I interviewed in the Midwest, she's a Black woman. She shared with me that she was, she's at a senior level at this consumer products company. And she said when she started, she knew she was the only Black woman in her department. She said she then kind of in 6 months realized she was the only one in the entire company. And then she's come to find out she's actually one of the only Black women or Black people in her city or her town. And as she was talking to me, she was 45 minutes into the interview, she started crying because she said, I feel such a weight for representing all Black people at my company because I'm the only one that my colleagues ever have met. And she started listing out all the things she does. So she's like, I've changed my hair. I change how I talk. I change what I eat. I change what I talk about. I change what I read, right? And she went through the list of all the things that she changes as a result of feeling this pressure to be something and to represent something. And the reason she started crying, we had this really deep conversation, is that was none of what she was hired for. Her background is accounting, and yet she was in this role where she felt like she was what I call the representative for an entire race. And that is not uncommon for a lot of the women of color I interviewed, not maybe to that extent, but the sense that you are carrying a lot more, that you are carrying your community, you are representing others. Again, that's all eyes on you. And so there is this extra, I think, layer that we don't really fully understand, again, in this idea of meritocracy that is different and that we need to really unpack if we're going to really talk about, how it's different and what it looks like and why there are these extra pressures and these extra things that don't mean it's not, it's not impossible. It's just we have to understand what that looks like. And a lot of the women of color I interviewed, and I think this is true for a lot of women, we get asked to do a lot of things like culture building and other activities because we are one of the only. So when you are in those roles, I think a lot of us don't always understand what we can say no to.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to that narrative and that shedding idea of what you shed, that doesn't serve you. What I really coach women to do is to really be conscious of what are you taking on and what are you saying no to? And how do you know when you're being asked to do things that actually don't work for you? And being a lot clearer about those things, because I think a lot of us get asked to do things and we just keep saying yes. But at some point it starts to really, have a weight on a lot of us.
Yeah. So for those of you who feel you are asked this, she has a really good, these are possible responses. So choose what's authentically that works for you. And then if you are someone who maybe occasionally accidentally asks those questions as an ally, I loved reading the book because it helped me think through, what do I do? And I think that's one of the actions that for me, being a little bit in this space. So I do recruiting, but the point of recruiting is to put people in the right team, in the right culture where they're actually going to do their best work. And the only way I can do that is to stay curious. And so even though I've been in this space, I'm constantly learning from others around how do I make sure that I'm not tripping into all the things that I was taught from Southern parents who grow up in the Midwest, and we all have our stuff, right? So I love that. In terms of who do you follow? So I'm going to follow you. And I follow Shelley Carell at Stanford Clayman, for those of you who love this stuff. There's so much good research out there. Who are the people you follow?
Yeah, and I actually want to answer two questions or bring
good.
two things together as you say that, because I think what's interesting is I did write this book for women of color because I did not feel like there were business books, and Lata actually said this in the bathroom. There are not business books that written by us for us, right? So I was very conscious of how I wrote it and who I was writing it to. It's been really interesting because it's out for 15 days exactly today. And it's been a lot of white leaders who've actually picked it up and who've read it and contacted me. I think because there is maybe more willingness now to talk about that lack of meritocracy than there ever was before, but there's still not an understanding of why and how. Right. And if nothing else, the book kind of lays out all the extra things or why I think it's different for us. And there is a lot in the book about what you can do if you're an ally, or what you can do when you see something. Because I think the other challenge is most of us aren't taught to talk about race, especially in workplaces. It's such a new topic, right? It's just the last year or two we've been taught that race doesn't really show up at work, right? And it does, and we have to be able to talk about that. And for most of us, especially if you come from an immigrant family, I was just taught, again, work hard, it'll all be okay. And so when we're confronted with these situations, I didn't have the tools. And I think a lot of my peers don't have the tools because we don't expect it to happen. And so, yes, I do talk in the book about if you face a microaggression or if something happens to you that feels inappropriate, practice 3 things that you can say as a woman or as a woman of color, because I guarantee someone is going to say something inappropriate to you in the next year. So try,
next 2 days.
Next 2 days. I don't appreciate what you just said. Can we stop the meeting and talk about what was just said? I need to unpack what you just talked about, over lunch or whatever, however you want to do it. But 3 things that you practice and literally practice, because in a moment where someone says something, it is sometimes hard to find your voice. It's hard to not feel the shame. So many of us feel the shame. We literally think we did something wrong, where we feel like heat. We feel like that feeling in our stomach, like it's us, and it's not. And so practice those 3 things. But what I'm realizing is I think allies also need to practice those three things, right? So if you see something, if something is just said that doesn't feel right to you, it's okay for you to say, can we stop the meeting? Can we just talk about what was just said? I really want to unpack that after the meeting. But you also need to practice, because you've never also been taught what to say when someone says something like that. And so we live in this culture where we are not taught how to do these things, and they're not hard things to do. Yep. We just don't have the knowledge or the skills or the training. And so that's part of what this is about. It's about demystifying that so that we can take some of the emotion out of these complicated situations.
I love that.
So just to kind of answer the question. So I've been surprised about who's shown up and who's really kind of gotten behind the book, because I really wrote it for my sisters, just wanting that book that I had never had. Who I follow. So Rashma Sajwani just came out with a book today, and she's a good friend, and it's called Pay Up, and it's about moms in the workplace and how there's a whole different challenge and the system is not working for them. Ruchika Tulshian also wrote a book on women of color that came out the same day as mine, and she is actually a journalist by training. So her book is very more practical, whereas mine's a little bit more philosophical and kind of big picture idea. Hers is much more in these situations, here's what you do. So if you're not getting paid fairly, here's what you do. If you are getting spoken over in a meeting, here's what you do. So I love that that's kind of a good comparison, or a good
companion book.
And so someone I follow quite a bit. And then I think the other thing is that this space is just emerging. So Minda Harts was one of the first that I know of to write in this space on women of color in the workplace. But I feel like we're starting to see more. There was a wave of books that just came out on how the workplace is different for different groups. And so I think you're going to see more. I think it's an emerging space.
Yeah, thank you. Do we want to open up for questions? Are we ready? Anyone? Yes.
I have a tough question to ask. And
Okay, hold 1 second because you've got a mic so the streamers can hear you. Thank
Okay.
you.
tough question to ask and maybe even tougher question to answer. So I'm a white woman, 30 years in corporate America. I could fill a chapter, if not an entire book, on inappropriate things that were done and said during the course of my career.
Mhm.
I'm curious, managing a lot of people, including women of color. I'm curious as to whether or not is it a Venn diagram? So is it women? Is it women of color, and is it a Venn diagram? In other words, in terms of the issues that we face in the workplace and how to address them. Does that make sense?
Kind of, I'm asking some clarifying questions. So you're asking, are the issues overlapping? Is that kind of
Yes.
what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah,
So many of the things that you were talking about resonate with me as a woman, and I'm trying, and listening to you, I'm trying to think about, how on a spectrum does it go further with women of color, and
Yep.
and are there additional things that allies, white women, need to be thoughtful about, when managing or mentoring or promoting or hiring women of color?
Yes. So I do think that the issues overlap. I wouldn't say that they are a complete Venn diagram for me in my mind is kind of there's only so much in the center that's shared. Whereas I do think that there are a lot of issues that are shared, but I also think there's these extra issues, these on top of issues that we don't get to talk about that are different for women of color, right? So today's equal pay day. So if you look at just those stats, right, women of color and especially Black women are not paid anywhere near white women. They're not hired at the same rates. They don't get promoted at the same rate. So just on the data level, there's a fundamentally different reality happening for women of color by group if you look at that data. And we need to kind of unpack why is that happening. And that's happening because of bias that exists in who hires and who promotes and who, how promotions are done. We were talking about that before. Some of the data in the book suggests that we tend to hire and promote people that look like us. And so I went through some exercises with people, and that is very much, and if you look at who's sitting in seats of hiring and promoting, you're going to end up with more white people in those seats because of who's sitting in those recruiter and HR seats. So I think
Unless you hire a modern recruiter. Thanks.
Yes, yes. Of course, that's true. But I think in traditional companies, right, that's who's sitting in the seats. And it's actually also who's sitting in the seats. Like one of the chapters goes through a lot of the challenges when women of color in particular raise issues. So I do feel like a couple of years ago around Me Too, there was like a change in how we actually process issues when women raise them, right? When we talk about sexual harassment or talk about some of the other issues that all women face. I don't think we've gotten there when it comes to race because it's such a new topic of talking about in the workplace. So the data suggests that when women of color or people of color raise race issues at work, the systems and the processes actually aren't set up to actually take those in. So there's no way that those get handled. And in fact, there's retaliation, there's actual shaming, there's sidelining. There are actually different things that happen because, again, people sitting in the seats don't actually understand race or can't really interpret it. There's also a lot of conversations that happen, I think, because we're so new on race where we think it's the same, but there's this other layer that we're just starting to understand. So I do think that although some of the issues are the same, I think the data would suggest that the experience of women of color is fundamentally different. I think the reporting is fundamentally different. And I do think there's extra layers and some of the extra things that women of color are asked to do that layer on top of that.
Can I just follow up? So white women, hiring, managing women of color, advice.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a big question. What I would say is maybe I'll give you this stat because this is one of the most surprising stats. We did some research with Billie Jean King in the fall. My company did. And one of the stats that really stuck out to me was 91% of white women said they wanted to sponsor or mentor a woman of color. And then we asked those exact same white women, are they mentoring or sponsoring? And only 9% were. So I think there is a fundamental gap between what we think we are doing, especially as women, and what we are not doing. One of the biggest things that I found in the research. So number one issue I found in the book was that women of color were sick. So 2 out of 3 women I met were sick, and sick with some sort of mysterious illness like I had. And so I go through kind of why that's happening, and that's happening as a result of being in a structure that doesn't see or hear them. The second most surprising thing that I heard as I met with all these women is at the end of the interview, I'd say in the last 5-10 minutes, is there anything else you want to share? And they would literally drop their voices. They would almost look at the floor and they would say to me, can you talk about how we don't help each other as women? And that white women are usually the ones that hurt us the most, but we also don't help each other as Indian women to Black women, or even Indian women to Indian women. That we've been set up with this idea that there is a competition, right? There's one seat at the table, and I talk about this quite a bit. And as a result, we're going to compete for the one seat, but especially if it's a woman of color, there's definitely only one seat for her. So this idea of zero-sum game and that we are all struggling for that one seat makes us in competition with each other. So I think part of what we have to realize is that there is a different experience. I think part of what we have to start to think about differently is that there isn't this one seat, and that this idea of competition in these workspaces is also something, it's a myth that we've been taught. And so how do we unprogram that? How do we redo that? And how do we actually move from wanting to help people at that 91% level and, versus what's really happening at the 9% level?
And I'll add on some data. I love your question. It's like such an important question, and question, bring it on, right? So when Cheryl did her book on Lean In, the first criticism she got was that it was very white woman centric and she didn't have the data on intersectionality. So she went back to the researcher at Stanford and said, teach me about intersectionality. So intersectionality is you are female and a person of color, right? So for a Black man, he's got, he's male, but he can't be angry in the boardroom. That shows up differently than a white man in a boardroom. And so what we learn by following the research, by being curious, is how do these biases interrupt the whole point of business or life, which is a meritocracy. Like, we want to hear each other. We want everyone's voices to be heard. We don't want it to feel zero sum. The other point of data that really helps women help other women is to know that their voice actually isn't heard when they're the only. So data show that if there's one woman at the boardroom, and it has, I think it's like to be less than 33%. Yeah, it has to be 33%. But the point is the board number matters. Like, so let's say it's 10 board members. If there are not 3.3 women at the board, they're actually tokenized. The way that our brains work from a neuroscience perspective is like, I only see you for your gender when there's only one of you. I just categorize you that way. But if there's 3 women, it's actually 33%. So it's like 3.3 women at the table on a 10. Now I'm no longer going to say, well, I think that's the woman's idea. Instead, it's like, there's 3 people, now I'm heard. So that's when Madeleine Albright had this, fantastic quote of like, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. It's because actually by raising up more women, we'll be heard. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's a like, let's all be heard, right? So knowing this data helps us to just see it differently, and then to stay curious for what does intersectionality mean now that we're starting to wake up to the fact that it's not the same for all, nor the same for all men, right? Race matters. And also socioeconomic and age and ability status and health status. Like, all of these things are things to be like really curious about. Because when we're designing products and we're leading companies, we want to think about who's the end user. Not all the end users are all white straight men, right? In fact, most of the purchasing power is done by women. And so it's really helpful to be able to understand who are we actually serving, so that when we're on an airplane, we're thinking about all of our customers and not just those of us who designed it and have a certain way of living in the world, right? It's actually kind of I think once you awaken it to it, it's fascinating, like how humans see each other and how we can really actually all be better off by staying curious for the differences. Like, that's actually really good.
Yeah, I'd also ask you to go look at the board research. So as we have mandated, right, more women on boards and other things, if you actually look at the data, it's actually helped white women. So there tends to be a gap when actually programmatic things are put in place where they actually help white women, but they're actually not reaching women of color. So again, data-wise, I just think that there is a gap in maybe our intention and what's actually happening. And the experience of women of color. If you actually look at the last 2 years and how many women of color have left the workforce, especially Black women, it's been at disproportionate rates to go start their own businesses and create their own cultures as a result of not being in spaces where they feel like they can, be in full voice or be themselves in any sort of way.
You brought up, and then let's get another question, something I thought really stuck with me, which is white women are talking about burnout. and women of color are talking about essentially trauma, right? Like it's beyond burnout. So just think about that too when you hear things in the media like women are burned out. We're not all the same. We're not all dealing with the same stuff.
Yeah. So I talk about that in the book because what is different is in the last couple of years, as we have had more permission to talk about race, a lot of women of color are actually feeling race in their body, and it's a different experience, right? So it's one thing to be burnt out. I think everyone, across the world is probably burnt out from the last couple of years, but what happens when you also start to acknowledge race? And for most of us, we've been told it doesn't, racism doesn't exist for most of us, right? We've been taught to continue to work hard. We've been taught if you just do all of these things, you'll be okay. Again, I'm not saying everybody, but for the most of the 500 women I talked to were taught that. What's happened in the last couple of years of being able to acknowledge that racism is happening and is happening at work, they're actually feeling it in their bodies. And when I met with therapists and met with psychologists and other folks, that difference between thinking something is happening to you and then being told it's actually happening to you is a very fundamentally different physical thing that happens in your body. As a result of that, one of the words or the slogans we use is that white women are burnt out and women of color are actually traumatized, and there is a difference there. So I think that's also part of what we're talking about. So it's not just sexism, right? It's racism that's also happening and now being acknowledged as something that is happening to us. That is also very different.
More questions? I love all the heads.
Hi, I want to echo what you said. I 100% agree. And what makes me really sad is about 25 years ago, I started my career on Wall Street and I went to Berkeley and I interned at a big Wall Street firm. And then I was one of the very few women to get hired in, like 2 out of 22 in a training program. This isn't that, maybe 2 decades ago. And what made me really sad, and the manager used to say this in front of everybody, including, senior men at the company and everything else. Oh, you went to Berkeley, big diversified school. I have quotas. You need to find me a Black woman. You need to find me an Asian guy. And he would literally say this in front of everybody because San Francisco's the most diverse marketplace. So we have to fill quotas. So we have to fill quotas because Kansas City is never going to get the Blacks and the Asians. And he would flat out say that. And the sad thing is that I ended up leaving finance because I was part of over 1,000 women gender discrimination suit. And the harassment I was kind of used to in Wall Street, but it was actually finding out that I was getting paid significantly less than men that had less training, less licenses, and were bringing in less money. And of course, I didn't even find that out until I was, 1 foot out the door. And it was horrifying. And next to the gender discrimination class action of Walmart workers, which was sizably much larger, the one that I was involved in was second. And the pay differentials were even bigger because you're talking about brokers. Anyway, what makes me really sad is this: I gave up a career I loved, and I would have stayed on Wall Street if I was still there. My life, I'd be set now. And I moved into tech thinking that would be more equitable, or at least a little, and I had a lot of friends.
You thought it would be a meritocracy?
Yeah. And I had a lot of friends back then that were working at big software companies that, had a little more flexibility. They didn't have to wear suits every day. I mean, I'd wear a suit every day. And just, it seemed to be a little more friendly for women. And then when I got there, no. And I think maybe it was a little more subtle, and now I work in, tech and entrepreneurship, and I see the same types of things going on in terms of quotas. They're not going to use that word, but now you have big technology companies and some startups going, well, we need to hire a woman or a woman of color to meet numbers. But you have that same mentality that was there 25 years ago of mostly the men going, well, we have to hire this person. And the message isn't there of the pluses of having it. We all know the numbers, what diversity actually, improves your bottom line, and you have a better chance of, and women entrepreneurs outperform male entrepreneurs. They have a much harder time getting funded, but when they do, they outperform them. And it's crazy that female entrepreneurs are still only getting 2% of VC funding. It's just nuts. And it's really upsetting to me. But the thing that I belong to Female Quotient, I'm sure you're familiar with the group, but one of the things that the founder says, it's a great group. One of the things she says that I think is true is if we could have done it by ourselves, it would have happened by now. So my question to you is, and I truly believe this, that women can't do it alone. We have to bring the men and the white men and whatever, they have to believe and want to do it for the right reasons, not because they feel there's a quota. And so it's starting to happen where LPs are starting to ask the big VCs, why don't you have more female founders? Why don't you have more women of color? Why isn't your portfolio representative of society? But it's not happening fast enough, and the impact just isn't there. So I'm wondering if you have some concrete examples of just ideas of what we can do to change it.
Ideas of how to change I'm just trying to understand the question.
Well, I think we're not really going to be successful unless men, because they still are 96% of the VC decisions in dollars are
Yeah.
made by men.
Yeah. So I hear you. So a couple of things in there. So one, your story of leaving the industry is really interesting in that I think that's still happening. So there were
The firm still has actually fewer female vice presidents than 25 years ago when the EEOC mandated we had that more women. There's actually less now. It didn't change at all.
Yeah. So there were 8 women that I interviewed that were kind of VP and C-suite level in particular, who had all basically exited their industry, exited their company, exited their industry after actually telling their story and filing a case of discrimination or filing a case of racism, back to the fact that the processes don't work. So what you'll actually find if you meet with a lot of employment lawyers is that the process is not set up that once you actually tell your story, once you actually file your case, you end up actually exiting. So that is actually something that is common, just to kind of tie back to your question, which is why this, I think, is continuing to be a problem. There's not really space to even talk about when there is discrimination or when there is racism or something happens. To answer your question on the men, I agree. Like, the book is not about let's push out all the men and let's have a different conversation. But I come from a place of, I don't think women of color have ever had the space or the permission to have the conversation. And so I come from a place of let's us get together and understand what we even think is broken, what we think we want to have, what we think will work for us, how we find our power in systems in society that doesn't actually think we're powerful. And then we can go have conversations with others. It doesn't mean that men can't get together and have conversations. It doesn't mean we can do this without them. I agree with you. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the delusion of the zero-sum game, this idea that, I talk about it in that I was at an Aspen meeting, and one of the men kind of leaned over and said, "Have you ever heard this term? I got white manned." And he was basically using it to describe a situation where a woman of color got an opportunity and was feeling like in their company, whenever a woman or woman of color got promoted, they actually had this saying, because it was happening quite frequently, they believed that they were getting white manned. And we had a whole discussion about how that's really not a helpful point of view to have, because if you believe that, you're going to end up in a situation where everyone gets tokenized, right? And so I think we have to get to a place where men also don't feel like opportunities that come to us are actually taking opportunities from them. It has to come back to that idea of there can't be limited seats. And we absolutely need them to be in this process of change with us. Unfortunately or fortunately, most of the seats are still occupied by white men. So if they don't actually agree that there is a power challenge, it's going to be very slow to change anything. But I also think we need to have some of the discussion about what we're looking for and what is not working and how do we want it to evolve. And I think part of why we also need to have this conversation now is because if there was ever going to be a time where it changed, in my opinion, it's now. The last 2 years have taught us so much about, empathy, about caring, about how we want to lead differently, how we want to live differently. And if we actually don't change workplaces now, as we are starting to return to work and realizing even the models of how we work are broken, I don't know that they'll ever change. And so I think we're just in a critical moment where it's important to have the discussions and to figure out what's not working and talking about it in a very different way. And then to work with white women and to work with men to actually make and evolve systems. You can't do it. You can't do it on your own. I recently gave a speech and I edited something that was in the book. I used to call it power of me, power of we. And I do believe now there's maybe the power of us because we all have to do it together. But I think unless we know the we and we know the me, it's really hard to kind of have the us, because a lot of white people are looking for us to have the answers. And I'm just saying that I've never had the space to have the conversation about what's not working until the last couple of years. And so I think when we hold space and information, it's the first time a lot of women of color have come together to even talk about the fact that discrimination and racism exists at work. We've had those feelings, but we've actually never talked about it. So if we don't get clear on what it means, if we don't get clear on where our power sits, if we don't get clear on what we want, it's very hard to ask other people to help change it. That's my point of view.
Well, and I love that I do see your power rising in the sense of, first of all, you're raising your own power by sharing all this information, your story. You're giving a space for other women of color to tell their stories, because you're really creating shared power. I think that other thing that is changing is, instead of it being their great resignation, what they're actually finding is it's really a great reassessment. Like, people still need to work. They just don't want to work for the companies where nothing is changing around gender equality and nothing is changing around racial awareness and sensitivity and true inclusion. Performative inclusion is like no one has tolerance for. So when companies call me and say, we want to hire and they tokenize the situation, I say, I'm sorry that I'm not your recruiter. Like, essentially, we have a choice every day to make decisions of, do I align with a company that's genuinely interested in, we would like to have a gender, balance, which means 50-50, not 33 and a third, right? We're genuinely interested in people of color rising. We want to look at all of our data. It's not a token situation. Then you get people who want to work with you, right? I think sidelining essentially the people who are performative is going to be one big shift, because right now, with a very tight economy, the people who get to make the decisions are high performers who are like, I'm only going to align with a culture that is building towards a more true meritocracy versus feeling like they're being handled by quotas, right? That's such a 1970s mindset that,
Yeah, I mean, it is. At the same time, I've evolved my own thinking on quotas. If you had asked me 5-10 years ago, I was very against them. I'm at a point now where I think it actually helps get women and women of color in seats, and we can actually get to the 33% and make change. Then I'm actually not against it. My challenge is that the experience of those 33% is what the first few and only is. Like, when you're the only, there is a lot that comes with that. I mean, really what we're talking about is the shadow side of being a trailblazer that we don't often talk about. We just kind of talk about the positives, and there are other things that come with that. And my thinking has evolved because I hope, like, once you get 3 or 4 people in the seat, that you can actually change and evolve thinking. But it's a difficult road to get there. I tell a story in the introduction where I was had just made partner, and I was sitting in New York and with a really good friend of mine from business school, and someone I'd known for a really long time. We were both celebrating. He had just made partner in his firm as well. And as we were kind of lifting our champagne glasses, I said to him, I'm really stressed about what comes next, because I had made partner when the economy was tanking. Like, there was a lot of pressure. My account had gone away. So I was sharing with him, I was very stressed about doing well. And he kind of looked at me without missing a beat. And he's a white gentleman. And he said to me, you have nothing to worry about. You're a twofer. You're going to have like the rest of your partnership made for you. But me, I'm going to have to really work because I'm a white man and nothing is going to be handed to me. And and that was, that's probably 14 years ago now. And I told that story to start with because my challenge is that was a really good friend of mine. He said that to me without skipping a beat, right? And so if he's saying that to me, what is everyone else saying about me or saying about my promotion? And so back to your point of, I think this is true for women too, but I think there's just an extra layer that comes with being, because there's just fewer of us, right? There's more questioning of how did I even get there? Like, why am I there? I'm always having to prove myself. For me, it was always more age related than it was race or gender. I always looked younger than I was, and I made partner in my early 30s. And so there was always a, like, where is the senior partner? Or where is the, like, are you here to take notes? Are you here to get coffee? Like, those were real things that I think a lot of women go through. But I think because I was even younger looking, like, happened almost on a regular basis. And so it takes a lot in you to kind of survive those situations and to believe you have confidence. It takes a lot to kind of navigate those situations and not have power taken from you. And I think we just don't talk about that enough, right? Because if those things happen every single day, they do start to eke at your self-confidence. And so it's partly just acknowledging that they exist so that they can't take power from us.
Good evening. I wanted to piggyback on your statement about 91% of over here. 91% of white women said they would mentor a woman of color. Only 9% are. So the question is, do the 91% not know how to mentor, or they are confused about what we want versus what they want? I am a professional real estate person of 18 years, and I do mentor a lot of people now, but I didn't have that coming into the business, and I wondered why I didn't have that.
I think it's all of the above. So I think it's partly that they're, and to be fair, and I don't want to, this is not all a negative message. And I think everyone's really overworked and everyone's really tired. And even white women who are sitting in the seats, there's a lot of pressure to maintain where they are. There's a lot of eyes on them as well. There's a lot of pressure of, there's research in the book around Queen Bee. And it's this idea that sometimes when women get to the seat, they don't necessarily want to associate with other women because it can be a bad thing, because they actually get favored or actually get more points for actually being recognized with the dominant group, right? So in this case, associating with white men, like if you actually are showing favoritism to women, it actually can come back to bite you. So there's research like that. What I found in my discussions was it was a little bit more of just being busy and not really realizing that they weren't doing it. I think that was candidly part of it. I think the other part of it is we tend to, similar to hiring and promoting, we tend to gravitate towards people who look like us when we sponsor. So there's a lot of research done on sponsorship, and Black women in particular, but women of color get sponsored less because we tend to gravitate towards people who look like us. And so I do think there's a little bit of that by default. I tell a story where I ended up doing this program when I was with Deloitte. It's called the Imagine program. And I was a new partner. I was matched with a senior partner, and you spend a year kind of mentoring with them. And it's a very kind of prescribed program that the firm doesn't do anymore. But when I did it, it was life-changing because I walked into the room, and I can tell you the senior partner I was assigned to, his name is Jerry. He's a great friend of mine now. I wanted nothing to do with him. Like, he walked into the room and I saw him and I thought, there's nothing we're going to have to talk about. And he walked and looked at me and was like, I don't want to spend the next year with this, young, like, girl that dresses very hip. Like, I just don't want to be in a room with her. I have nothing to do with, nothing in common with her. He ended up becoming one of my biggest sponsors because in the second meeting, we had a long conversation about imposter syndrome. So one of the other things the research suggests is that women, but in particular women of color, carry a large amount of imposter syndrome. So this idea that we don't know what we should know, right? And again, I believe that comes from the system and all the things that we're taught, back to that meritocracy idea. We are given a lot of messages that we aren't those things, so we end up carrying that unless we do the work to shed that. So I said to him, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. And third sentence is, he says to me, Deepa, you don't think I have imposter syndrome? And he went through his long list of imposter syndrome. He said, I've just been taught not to talk about it, right? Which is very common, the difference between men and women. He ended up becoming one of my biggest mentors because in him sharing his imposter syndrome, we realized we have so much more in common, but that would have never happened if that hadn't been a forced situation, because upon looking at each other, we saw no connection to one another, right? So I do think that's also happening. So it's a long story too. I think it's both. I think we just don't pay attention because we're all busy and trying to just keep our plates afloat. And then I think secondly, we do tend to kind of just gravitate towards people who we have some comfort with. And we don't always cross lines of race because it's just not something we do normally. So my request of all of you is to be more conscious of it. It doesn't mean we can't do it, but to be more conscious of doing it.
One more question. I'm going to start with a little story for you guys because I think we were talking about it when we were driving in. I'm an engineer from Cal, and I have one of those names that is gender neutral because nobody knows my name. It's Sharore Tabafrashti. Okay, you see that on a resume, you assume what? Some guy, an engineer from Middle East or somewhere else, right? And I was just telling my friend on the way right over of the experience that one of my professors while I was in PhD program at Cal had set up this interview with two very prominent structural engineers in the Bay Area. And I had shown up dressed up because I never got dressed up, and he had told me to get dressed up for this interview. And I got up there, and the two guys assumed that I was interviewing for the secretary job because they were waiting for a male guy to show up, right? So as a female engineer in the industry with the strange name that usually they expect a guy to show up on the Zoom link or anything else, it's been constant for 4 decades. I'm just going to count for you. 4 decades. We've been working toward equity for women. We've been working toward acknowledgement of our skills and abilities for women, all sorts of things for 4 decades. And what I am so disappointed in is that we seem to have the same struggle over and 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 over. And I'm going to continue saying over because it has not changed that much. A lot of the younger engineers and folks that come on believe that things are much better. They don't realize what we have done for that better to look better. And in terms of understanding of the door that is open today, it was not open before. We had to actually crash through it. And you would get to see and actually be at the seat because we actually broke all the doors to actually get there. But one of the things that I wanted to express about the white male to woman of color association, because the image is right there and I really appreciate it in front of me, is that, as you said, people feel a level of comfort with someone who can speak and look like them. And I want to say those two words together because speak and look like them together makes a big difference. I was interviewing candidates for employment. I chose my two top candidates to be two females. One was of Oriental origin, like they were Chinese in this particular case. And she was an extremely good engineer. And my boss, who was a white male, identified with a white woman as the candidate and chose her over my advice because she sounded like him. And as a result, he suffered for 2 full years of a non-performer, right? And I think it's important for us to recognize the challenges when we're hiring and the challenges when we're selecting our candidates, the challenges when we are advertising, whether what we're looking for. My comment is basically I'm really glad that you wrote the book. I'm hoping that we can pass it. I'm going to pick up the book and put it on my LinkedIn and for everybody to actually see that's available. One of the big things that I have struggled with, and I'm leaving my engineering firm alone and kind of relaxing and trying to retire, as my friend said, is like, I feel sad that all our work has to get redone again and again and again and over. My question is, what is the magic potion to stop having to do it again and again and again?
I can't wait.
Yes, I mean, it sounds like a tough question, but I actually love the question because it's actually pretty common. So I met a number of women, I call them legacy women, meaning they were close to retirement or kind of sitting on boards and looking back at their career. And they would say the same thing. They would say to me, there was one woman in particular, CFO of a public company, and she said to me, it's no different than when I entered 40 years ago. And she started crying. She's like, I want to believe like my 40 years was worthwhile. And we kept talking and kept talking. And part of what she had believed erroneously, and I think most of us are taught, is once she got to the seat, when she got to the C-suite, she would do it her way. That, as long as she edited and she gave up certain things along the way, it was okay, because once she got to the top, then she could completely do it her way. And the challenge is that most of us are not able to do it our way because there's even more pressure to conform at the top. That's really what we're trying to talk about. So my magic for everybody is that I think we have to stop accepting that the system is the system. We have to stop accepting that this is the way that we have to perform, that we have to lean in, that we have to do things to get ahead. We have to start exerting our boundaries and start talking about the ways in which we intend to show up. I'm not telling women of color to show up and be authentic in all ways at all times, because I actually don't think that's helpful. But I think it's deciding for you, here are the 10 things I'm not willing to compromise on, and I am showing up in those 10 ways every single time. And if someone asks me to compromise, I'm not going to do it. And here's why. So I think it's actually not fitting into the system anymore. I think it's starting to say it doesn't work, and here are the reasons why it doesn't work, and here's what I'm going to do as an individual. I also want to just touch on, you said chat, and I interviewed a lot of younger folks. But what I found with them is they're not staying in these situations for that long. So they're getting into large corporations for a year or two to extract what they can extract, and then they're that they think it's any better. I think they just don't have the expectation that we did, that, we're going to change it or we're going to be there for 20 years or something else. I think it's just a different mentality. So I think, again, we're in a moment where change is possible. The book there's a lot of hard parts to it, but there's actually a lot of optimistic parts. And I think we're in a moment where we have more ability to define our power and define what we want, and what we can define what our legacy should be as women of color in a way that I don't think we've ever had permission or space to do before. And I think it comes with us being really clear about what we're not going to accept anymore and what we want as our future. And that means saying that at work as well. I think that's what's different.
I think that's a great idea. I would love to see if we could take this moment, this really magical moment, because this is really unique in terms of the universal acceptance of value of women. If all women got together, all women of all over the world, for a whole week to take a vacation, Didn't do anything. Just took a week of vacation and not do anything. Did not lift a finger to take care of a child, not an elder, not volunteer at the hospital, not to take care of the homeless. All the things that we do, if we did not do them for 1 week, I think the world would fall apart.
We've got time for one more question.
Okay, and while you do that,
Thank you.
I want to add one thing to that just because I love it so much. So raise your hand if you know Serena Williams' husband. Right.
Yeah.
Yes, he has a name, but I like calling him Serena Williams' husband. Alexis. Anyway, he is, to me, the next generation man, because I think this ideal worker norm was a box. Like if you watch Mad Men, like Don Draper was not a happy man, right? It's a box that they have to live in that doesn't seem to work for them either. And what I see in the next generation men is them saying, I don't want your definition of ideal worker. And I'm actively going to take whatever power I have and change it to be an active parent, a supportive husband, give up my board seat on Reddit. So look for how the next generation is looking at life in a different way, which she brings up beautifully in her book of the like, why are we working? Like, what is the point of all this? Right. And he's a business owner who realizes the data, what we were talking about earlier, which is actually it is a meritocracy when we take care of these things. Like this is a win-win. So that's where I see the fundamental shifts is super important for every human to have the data and own her power and her boundaries. And how do we reimagine what the ideal worker looks like? So we have a new collective ideal worker, which is about well-being and about win-win-win and about a true meritocracy. Okay, sorry.
I was just thinking after all that, the picture in the New York Times when they put Venus Williams instead of Serena
Oh my God,
last
I
week,
pulled my hair out.
That was
So bad.
That was bad. Deepa, first of all, let me applaud you for what you have done, because your statement about we're working so hard to fit the system, but the system is broken and
Yeah.
maybe it's not us. I think that's brilliant and enlightening. I want to know a little bit about your personal journey. Like, did you have this great American novel always inside of you and you converted it to this?
Yes.
Or
you're
is
writing.
it the genesis of your prior career path?
Yeah, I don't have a magical answer to that other than I have always liked writing. I don't know that I thought I was going to write a book, but I've always liked writing. And when I exited my corporate life, I think I had to make sense of what had happened and what I wanted to do next. I needed some space. So I ended up, I was pretty sick. So I ended up spending 8 months in bed while I took a leave of absence to figure out what was next. I got a lot of advice from my mentors who didn't want me to leave and who also said, you have to go to something. You have to know what's next. And I didn't.
Old mythology
Yes,
shit.
Yes. And when I left, did not have the what's next. And I sold the book 6 weeks after George Floyd's murder. So I was in the moment where I think there was an openness to this conversation in a very different way. We were talking about this over dinner. I ended up with one of the best agents in the country. After one discussion in 24 hours, I ended up with a book deal.
This never happens. Raise your hand if you've ever
in-
heard, book deal just magically came.
in 3 conversations. And so it all really moved quickly. And then even the writing process moved really quickly for me. And so I think part of it is we don't talk about it enough. And one of the things that I want to do next is help more women of color tell their stories, because I think that's a gap. If you actually look at the data, only 11% of books are written by women of color. And yet Black women in particular are the biggest buyers of a lot of books, especially in spaces like this. And so it's kind of interesting that there's a disconnect there. So I think we just don't know, how to do it. And so I want to kind of demystify that. In the same way we were talking, I ended up on main stage TED, right? That's also not a mystery. There's processes to get there. And so I think part of it is our communities just don't have those conversations. And there is a lot of who you know. I mean, the publishing industry is a very corporate sort of model that rewards, the same sort of processes as well. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it was a little bit of, I believe, serendipity. Like a lot of things showed up at the right times. I was willing to tell a story. I also felt like I was holding a container for a lot of women. So there was something magical of when I needed a particular voice or I wanted a particular industry, the person would just show up. And so I do think sometimes when you are following your path, the right things, show up for you and things are a little bit easier. And I think although for a long time corporate was easy for me, in the last couple of years it stopped being easy, which is also a signal for me it was time to get out. And so I think for me it was a little bit of finding my voice and making sense of like, why did I get so ill and why was I so unhappy? And why did it take me so long to leave? And why did I feel guilty leaving? I remember posting on LinkedIn when I finally decided to leave, and I must have had 200 or 300 in particular Asian practitioners reach out of all kind of different industries, men and women, asking me like, how did you quit? Like, what did you tell your parents? Like, what are they thinking? And I was in my 40s, right? Like, why would I care what my parents think if I'm quitting? But there's such a cultural, tie to that.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a little bit of, I just needed space to figure out what I was going to do next. And it became the book, and then it turned into everything else. So. Sure.
It's also a beautiful testament to some things aren't hard. Like some things, like it can feel like maybe this is hard, maybe this is a mountain, and maybe it's not, because all of the work you did before makes it actually a little bit more of a sled. I don't know. I think it's a fascinating testament to sometimes the work you did before creates the space for it to actually be easy.
Yeah. I mean, these were the things I talked about for 2 decades, right?
Yeah.
I led the women's initiative. So I worked
You
with a
knew
lot
it.
of women. This is what the space I was in. I don't know that I had the women of color bent to it, because I think for a lot of my own career, right, I focused on being a woman. I didn't focus on the women of color aspect because that was just part of who I was. We didn't talk about it.
Right.
And so I think it's only in the last few years I was able to unpack that was actually a factor, right? Or actually something that was also part of my identity that I had buried and wanted to talk about in a different way. So I think these are all emerging conversations for all of us. And I think part of what we need to see is more books and more voices, because there isn't one path, and we don't talk about that enough, right? Part of this work is really about showing there are many paths to success and many paths to putting your stories out there. And we just don't know what those look like all the time.
I'm curious if you watched the Melody Hobson TED talk. Raise your hand if you saw it. It's colorblind versus color brave. So since all of you are very interested, this is another TED talk that rocked me because I grew up in the Midwest, Minnesota. And we would definitely say to each other, we don't see color.
And one of my delusions in the book.
Yeah. So it's like we thought that meant I just see everyone as equal, but what we were actually doing was like invalidating the fact that they have pigment in their skin. Like, I don't see it,
Yeah, well, it's ignoring the fact that our paths walked are different, right?
Yeah.
By people saying you don't see color, it's actually denying the fact that the world does show up differently for us, and there's different experiences, and that we need to talk about that. And
Yeah.
we're ignoring that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so grateful that you took all of this incredibly hard-won experience and made it a path that is so accessible to all of us. I read her book. I will say it's very easy to read, and it's a reread. It's a flag it. I highlighted things. So I just want to thank you for raising your voice.
Thank you for being conversation.
Fun. And please share it, because this is it's really important. And then you talk about sharing it on LinkedIn. It's really important that we continue to lift the voices. It really is a win-win-win. Like, I married a straight white man. I've birthed one. I'm not against them. This is a win-win-win. And so just being able to have the conversation, continue the learning journey, follow the leaders, and then continue to raise your voice. Because the best way you can honor her work is by you raising your voice and your impact and your power. So thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
I'm just going to remind you all that Deepa's